Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
On this week's episode of A Nation of Taxpayers with me, Duncan Barks, I'm joined in the Taxpayers Alliance studio by Will Yarwood from the TPA. Hello, Will.
Hi, Duncan. How are you, mate?
I'm very good. Good to see you again. Thank you for being here. And our guest this week is, well, Patrick, I don't know how to describe you, that you're a man of many talents. Former MEP, political commentator, former political editor of a national newspaper. Patrick O'Flynn, welcome.
Good morning, Duncan.
Listen, a lot of stuff to talk about here. Let's just do a bit more of a thumbnail sketch, Patrick, about yourself. Former political editor of the Daily Express, former UKIP MEP. Then I think you did a few months as an SDP MEP. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's true.
And a political commentator writing for the Specky, the Spectator, the Critic, Daily Express, popping up alongside myself and even Will here on GB News from time to time, fighting the good fight. So a ton of things to talk about. And the other thing to mention, of course, is your State of the Nation Substack that people can search for and subscribe to, which is a cracking read.
State O the Nation.
State O the Nation.
I should make clear, and it's meant to be an incredibly witty pun on my surname.
It's a good pun. State O the Nation. Which is on Substack. Please, if you're listening to us at the moment, check it out and subscribe. So a ton of stuff to talk about here. I think before we look at some of the political issues of this week, and my, there's a lot to talk about. I'm interested in your kind of your transition really from journalism to ultimately becoming a politician. So you're at the Daily Express, you're a political editor there, and I remember a time, because you and I used to talk, when you were becoming warmer, if you like, towards UKIP at the time. So we're going back, 14 years, 15 years,
more,
I think? More. Yeah. You were becoming warmer towards UKIP, and then at some point you made the switch. What made you do that?
Well, thinking back, 'cause it is a long time, as I was political editor and then chief political commentator for the Daily Express, in the dog days of the last disastrous Labour government, the Gordon Brown end being the focal point. And really back then, part of the basic job was to help get Labour out of Downing Street. And that meant giving favourable coverage to David Cameron. But once that had been achieved, and we then had the Cameron-Nick Clegg coalition.
Yes.
And it was while the Euro crisis was gathering pace. We'd obviously had the free movement crisis, the A8 accession with no transitory controls on Labour, and then they followed it up with the A2, Romania and Bulgaria, enormous migrant influxes, and the British net bill going up and up and up. So after that election in 2010, on summer holiday, I kind of thought about the future and the big picture, and that there was no good news coming out from the EU for the United Kingdom, for the foreseeable future, if ever. And I knew the Daily Express readers were very unhappy with membership. Until then, being a eurosceptic newspaper just meant moaning about individual things. But, we'd had also the Lisbon Treaty, referendum offered and then withdrawn. And it seemed to me suddenly that economically, withdrawing from the EU had become doable, and that from a sovereignty point of view, it had become essential, and particularly in terms of, if you like, the unmaking of Britain via mass migration, that something had to change and there needed to be a restoration of nation-state sovereignty. So the fact that Cameron was getting into bed, as it were, with Nick Clegg was obviously going to annoy a lot of core Conservative voters. At the same time, Nick Clegg getting into bed with Cameron was annoying a lot of left-wing Lib Dem voters. So Labour was going up 7 or 8 points in the polls. And it just seemed to me that if we could help UKIP go up 4 or 5 points in the polls at the Tory expense, then suddenly David Cameron would be looking at an electoral disaster. And I happened to take the view of him. He was someone without deeply, deeply embedded principles. And if you put him under pressure, you could get what you wanted from him. And that, as it turned out to be, was the referendum.
A bang-on assessment. So in many ways, I mean, yourself as a political editor, then chief political commentator, and then the newspaper, the Daily Express, very much early adopters of Brexit.
Yeah, so we came out for leave in the tail end of 2010.
Yeah.
And I must say that my peer group in the Westminster lobby kind of thought I'd
lost it,
gone a bit mad,
right.
And it was never going to happen.
Yeah.
But I thought, because of all the factors I've set out, actually we're either going to win this or we're going to come very close to winning it. I always thought, that we're onto something here. We just have to keep pressing.
And what's interesting with the readership of the Express, and I've always been a big fan of the Express. It's a newspaper my parents took when I was a kid, so I grew up with it. But you see, I think the readership of the Express is less, and I say this with respect, is less metropolitan than other newspapers. And we've talked about this before, Will, about Brexit, haven't we? That if you lived outside what I call the M25, the Westminster bubble, if you spent time in places as I have, like Newcastle or other parts of the United Kingdom, Brexit wasn't a massive surprise. You could feel it. The mood in the pubs, people would talk about the EU and they'd simply had enough. And I think the Express kind of tapped into that very early on.
I think we did. And as you say, it has more of a provincial, probably slightly more lower middle class readership. The self-employed people, the shopkeepers, the foremen. It's kind of backbone of Britain.
Yeah.
And the same. Talking to normal people outside the M25, it was obvious that the level of unhappiness for how much of our democratic decision making was being grabbed by this thing. That there had to be a democratic moment about do we want this, and the case for arguing this is no longer in the national interest was growing stronger all the time.
Do you remember that time, Will? I mean, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here because obviously Patrick and I have just a few years on your good self. Do you remember that kind of time or that moment when you became aware that Brexit might be a thing?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about how you were seen as a bit insane in the lobby for being pro-Brexit in 2010. I was pro-leaving the European Union when I was 15.
Excellent.
That was my first proper political opinion, actually. It's the first thing that motivated me to get into politics, actually. Mainly because of the, if you remember, this is really going back, I was all but 15 back then, unlike the old man I am now. It was the 7-way debate they had on ITV between all the main party leaders. All of whom, except one or two of them, are not around anymore. And it seemed to me what was weird was every single party and every single politician, except for Farage, was pro the European Union. And I thought, as 15, being the contrarian that I am, I thought, okay, so why is only one person seem to be in favour of leaving the European Union? And then I looked more into it, not just regarding the immigration stuff, but also regarding the nature of the European Commission, the European Parliament, the fact that the European Parliament couldn't actually propose any legislation, it was all decided by the Commission, the fact that their accounts haven't been looked into or written off for decades, money just disappears into thin air, the expansive bureaucracy of it, the fact that it started off as the EEC and then morphed into the European Union without seeing so much of a vote. Obviously, I learned about the Maastricht Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. I was a very busy 15, 16-year-old. It was the first political opinion I ever had, and I lived in North East Wales. The constituency I lived in, Flintshire, voted about 55% for leave. Yeah. But I wasn't particularly surprised because even amongst members of my family, I mean, my dad was a UKIPper, but my mum was Labour. But even then, my mum was, very sort of old Labour to some extent. And of course, old Labour used to be the eurosceptic wing of politics, didn't it? Yeah. With Tony Benn and Dennis Skinner and the like, and it was the only a few right-wing Tories who were in favour of leaving the European Union. But I do remember it at the time, and I was thrilled, and it was the first time I ever stayed up to watch a full night of election stuff. I watched them stay the referendum, and I was thrilled. But I wasn't particularly surprised, in full, I'm honest with you, because even amongst living in Wales and living amongst people that you did feel that something what's happening and what's changing. Although the one thing I will say that I have slightly changed my opinion on is when I was 15, 16, I thought the European Union or leaving the EU would sort of be the answer to all the problems I had with politics at that time. It's clear that was just not the case, especially with immigration, because ever since we left the European Union, non-EU immigration has skyrocketed beyond immeasurable belief and is causing many of the problems we have now. So it's proving
that wasn't an automatic.
No,
that
no,
was
of course
a policy
not.
choice by the last.
It was a policy choice by
government.
Patel and by Boris, but nevertheless, it was the way in which politicians thought, oh, immigration's sort of not in the mainstream now, so now we can hike it up to insane levels and no one will care. I remember one senior Tory politician telling me that the British people didn't care about the numbers. It was all about control. It's all about control. That's all that mattered. And even if the numbers were high, as long as the people felt they had control over it, that was fine. But I think one thing that has proven to me is that Whitehall bureaucrats can be just as bad as a bureaucrat in Brussels.
Yeah, the lessons of life. What was it like becoming an MEP, Patrick?
It was quite exciting because I left the Express at the very start of 2014 to become the Director of Communications for UKIP, by which time I was number one candidate for the East of England. And considering that 5 years earlier, UKIP had won 2 MEPs in the East of England, I would have had to have been spectacularly bad at the job not to end up as an MEP. But, you know, it was an amazing experience being a core part of that campaign for the 2014 European elections, you know, and the first party to win a nationwide contest other than Labour or Conservative, I think going back about a century, certainly in living memory. And, you know, that was then followed fairly soon afterwards by the defections of Mark Reckless and Douglas Carswell. And, you know, you would turn a corner walking along with Nigel and sometimes there'd be 100 photographers, and it was really, you know, it was a game-changing moment. And it was, you know, I think subsequently the likes of Aaron Banks got this term, the bad boys of Brexit. But we obviously were the mavericks and the renegades. But there were some moments where, even in London after Nigel's second debate with Nick Clegg in the run-up to that contest, there was, you know, he won very clearly the debate, bigger than he won the first debate. We repaired back to the Guinea Grill off Berkeley Square, and black cab drivers were tooting their horns. And even in affluent central London, suddenly UKIP was in danger of becoming very popular.
You could see it and feel it. So I can relate to that, because there was a time where I walked down the street with Farage and black cab drivers would stop. And the only other politician I've seen in this country who's had that effect was Boris Johnson. And that's in this capital city, you know. So there is a magic about Nigel Farage as a campaigner, as we know. Let's just talk about him for a second, and I think we'll come back before the end of this episode and talk about where reform sits on the right of the political spectrum and stuff. Because you went from UKIP to the SDP as an MEP in the last few months of being an MEP. What caused that?
Well, what caused that was Gerard Batten had taken over the leadership. After there'd been a number of, if I can use the term, seat warmer leaders, where Nigel, for various reasons, was going through a phase where he didn't want to be the party leader. And he'd been very helpful in the campaigns of a series of leaders who'd won but hadn't lasted the course. And Gerard Batten, I'm not sure many of the listeners will know, was a very different tradition in UKIP, but he was a dug-in long-term UKIPper.
And he was MEP for London, wasn't he?
He was MEP for London. He was massively to the right of Nigel on social and cultural issues, but he had his own genuine power base in the party. But when he became leader, after these various short-term leaderships hadn't worked, he took up what I can only describe as a bit of a crush for Tommy Robinson, and he at one point made Tommy Robinson his advisor on a couple of key policy areas. When I stood for election in 2014, one of the things that helped UKIP MEPs get elected was that the party had a hard and fast rule that nobody who had been in the BNP or the EDL would be allowed membership of the party. And Gerard was obviously compromising that. And remember, this was late in 2018, so Brexit hadn't even been delivered. And there was still the possibility of another set of European elections in 2019. And yet Gerard was massively narrowing the potential appeal of UKIP, disabling it, in my view, from discharging its number one function that it was set up to do. And, in a very uncritical way, teaming up with Tommy Robinson and his acolytes. And I thought, that's not what I offered when I stood for election. It's not good politics. In various ways, it's not in principle right either. So I, in common with quite a few UKIP MEPs at the time, left the party, and rather than just sit as an independent, I thought it would be quite a creative thing to do, to support this tiny ongoing SDP, which had very sound policies on things like immigration and Brexit, and had been on the side of Brexit in the campaign, and just let people know about them.
Are you still involved with the SDP?
I'm still a member, but I'm not active.
Yeah, because I couldn't see anything when I was making a few notes. I couldn't see anything the last few years to suggest that you were active, but you're still a member.
Yeah, and I still look at their policy prospectus and think it's quite impressive. I think William Clouston, the leader, is an impressive guy as well. So I'm happy to still be a member, even though I would say on the economy, it's slightly more to the left than I would be comfortable with now, because I think we've dug ourselves into a real bad scene on the economy, and we need to do things like sharpen incentives, and that might well mean some tax reductions to get the marginal rate down for people in the middle. And so I would say quite a lot of the SDP membership is somewhat to the left. I'm an economic pragmatist, but I do see that the time makes it essential for a burst of free enterprise, wealth creation, sharpened incentive economics.
Because you've got a view, haven't you, about SDP and their economic policy?
Yeah, I do. I remember when I first sort of really bothered with Twitter during the COVID lockdowns, because obviously as a young man I've got nothing better to do during COVID lockdowns than to argue with people on Twitter.
Doom scrolling as well.
And there was a sort of weird resurgence in 2020, 2021 of the SDP, from what I remember. Actually, amongst young people, would you be surprised? I mean, they'd established a youth wing. A friend of mine was running to be the head of that youth wing. There was quite a lot of activity from people who were considering to leave the Conservative Party to go join the SDP, because it was more residually socially conservative and anti-immigration and things like that than what they saw as sort of the Boris Johnson Liberal Conservative Party, which I think was a fair criticism. But one thing, because I'm still relatively committed sort of libertarian, one thing that I was really surprised on is the way in which a lot of these people would talk about economics. And because often they'd subject economics to sort of a secondary discussion, and politics is what mattered first, when reality it should be the other way around. And
I'm not sure I can agree with that.
That's fair enough. That's fair enough. But the economic discussions I saw coming from sort of pro SDP types were the same kind of had the same kind of rhetoric and the same kind of economic understanding as like your average Ed Miliband supporter in 2015. They'd completely bought into the sort of austerity narrative. They completely bought into the state needs to do more narrative, despite the fact they were living in a COVID lockdown where the state was doing everything for them and was giving them all free money. And also the issue now is that although that I'd say it sort of residually died, I wouldn't say the SDP is as popular online as it once was during those times. And what I do see is that there are still a number of people who will criticise quote-unquote economic liberalism and laissez-faire capitalist economics, when in this country we haven't had that for decades at all.
But I would have to defend them a bit, which is where I think an economic position has gathered momentum in public debate is calling time on the naive approach to global free trade and getting into the nitty-gritty of the distributional impacts. I mean, you can all do this kind of Ricardo economics, division of labour, and suddenly everyone's got 6 widgets instead of 5. But if you're a bunch of guys who've worked in the steel industry in South Wales and your steel plant is shut down, perhaps you'll end up doing nothing. You're a human being, not an inert factor of production, right? And so perhaps the country somehow benefits overall from free trade, but if all the benefit is going to people who say work in financial services or in certain affluent areas, and a lot of the countries getting left behind, and I think Donald Trump and JD Vance share some of this analysis. I would agree that the US is in a much stronger economic position to go for its own new paradigm rather compared to us. But nonetheless, I think the SDP was instrumental in saying, hang on a minute, our country is not just a shop, right? It is our home as well, and we've got to look at the distributional impacts of this sort of feeling that you can't intervene when one of your economic crown jewels is either being bought up by a foreign entity or whether a strategic industry might be getting closed down. So I think they're very much still in the game on that side of things.
But don't you also see that a lot of the, for example, you mentioned free trade there, and you are right, there has been, the SDP I think is possibly one of the only few parties that does have like a clear sort of quasi-protectionist stance on these things. But also I'd say actually a lot of our political elite are adopting more of a protectionist stance. I mean, the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron himself complained about a trade deal made by Kemi Badenoch when she was at Business and Trade, and said that it was a bad deal for our farmers. I mean, that's the Liberal Democrat Party. That's liberal. Liberals are supposed to be in favour of free trade, and yet they're advocating for protectionism. Liberals in the 1910s used to run big posters saying, free trade means a more prosperous, busier Britain. Busy ports, busy Britain. Busy streets and things like that. And yet, in the Liberal Democrats, there is a protectionist angle. I think Labour's still got a protectionist angle in them. There's various backbench Tories who also have protectionist angles because they have like special interest groups inside their constituency they want to protect. But I still think, on a whole, free trade is positive. I mean, you would think I think that I work at the Taxpayers Alliance naturally, and I think the resistance to free trade in the UK is actually to our detriment, because if you're talking about traditions and things we do well, Britain does free trade really, really well. The US does have a history of protectionism, actually. A lot of their wealth when they first were created was because they had high tariffs and protectionism. Britain had a slightly different approach. I mean, we had a level of splendid isolation with our empire, but even then that was still trading with a bunch of other countries. I do agree with you that to some extent globalization has left things behind, but I don't think that means we should revert to an even more state interventionist, protectionist approach, because I think actually the state getting involved in the economy is one of the reasons we're in the mess that we're in now.
Right, I'm gonna take this offline because there's so many other things I want to talk about. But equally, I think this is a really interesting area that almost warrants its own podcast episode in the future. So let's park that for a second, because Patrick, I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about your most recent post on your Substack about One Nation Toryism, as I like to call it. But also, I just want to spend a few moments talking about Nigel Farage and also the Reform Party. When I was putting some notes together for this interview, I found a quote, and I don't know if it's true, that you branded Farage as snarling, thin-skinned and aggressive from 2015. Is that true?
Yes, and I apologised it.
Right, okay. Couldn't find any note of the apologies.
In the aftermath of the 2015 election, where I think everyone in UKIP was completely knackered.
Battered.
And for some reason, the idea that, we got a 14% vote share, but only Douglas Carswell got elected, that this was a catastrophic failure. Took hold. So I would compare it to after the Brexit referendum, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, everyone fell out, everyone was exhausted. And, we'd had a thing during that 2015 campaign, a very unhealthy thing in UKIP where there had become two capitals, as it were. There was Nigel fighting to win in Thanet and a group of fairly new arrivals in the party who were kind of ultra Farage acolytes, and then you had me and Suzanne Evans trying to kind of hold the campaign together in London. You had Douglas Carswell off doing his own thing. So what really prompted me to do that, to say those things, was that Nigel had backed himself into a corner by, I think it was to the Telegraph. He sold them this line that if I don't win in Thanet, I'm finished. And I always thought, well, hang on a minute, what if you don't win in Thanet? but somehow David Cameron's Prime Minister and he has to deliver a referendum, you're going to want to be a big part of that. Nigel then didn't win in Thanet, having put a bounty on his own head, as it were, and then sort of pretended he was standing down because he said he would. He then made Suzanne Evans, who was a good friend of mine, interim leader of UKIP, which he had no constitutional right to do. That was an NEC decision. Right. And he'd done it without really squaring it with Paul Nuttall, his very loyal deputy leader, who was another friend of mine. So by exhaustion, I was feeling annoyed that other people's work and reputations were being sacrificed on a fairly chaotic front. I think in retrospect, all of us should have had a week off and come back and thought, well, actually, we did pretty amazingly well there, and now we've got a referendum to fight.
Understood. You mentioned Suzanne Evans. I've always felt it's a shame she's not part of a political party. And I mean, I know she does punditry in various places and she's very good at it. But I always think it's a shame that she's not playing a more major part in our political world.
Yeah, the last time I spoke to Suzanne, I think it's fair to say that she's deeply, deeply disenchanted with the Conservative Party. So there wouldn't be an opening there. Yeah. And Reform, I'm not sure if the relationship with Nigel was ever mended. But I would actually say to Reform supporters listening to this, if you want somebody who will address one of your big weaknesses, which I think is policy development. Suzanne Evans did a fantastic job for UKIP in the run-up to the 2015 election in preparing a really robust and populist set of policies for the manifesto. You could do far worse than get a Reform high up to give her a phone call.
Well, let's talk about Reform in a bit more detail as we slowly move towards talking about the political right in this country on this particular episode. I mean, riding high in the polls at the moment, depending on most polls, Reform are certainly in the top two. What's your current take on this? Is it a blip? Is it simply a case of a disastrous start for Labour in their first 8 months of power? The Tories not really hitting the ground running with Kemi Badenoch and people's memories being long memories of the last 14 years. So people are going, what the hell, I'll go for Reform. I mean, where do you think they're currently at?
Well, I think Reform on average is just ahead in the polls and Labour's second and the Tories are 4 or 5 points back in third. I don't see this as a blip moment. I see this overwhelmingly hyper-mass immigration. Perhaps people think I'm exaggerating here, is destroying our country, right? It's destroying social solidarity. We're getting data in for differential rates of crime, attitudes towards women. The Boris wave seems to be the most, as well as being the biggest wave, the most culturally non-aligned wave, the least useful economic wave. We have our chronic housing shortages, which are deterring young Britons from having their own families.
Don't get him started on that.
Right. Well, I'm in complete agreement.
I think that the consensus we had with the establishment parties about send out the search parties, the Tories lying over 4 successive terms about bringing down immigration, and now the huge negatives, even the hate marches in central London, the amount of anti-Semitism, the constituencies which have gone full Islamist, that's the fastest expanding demographic in the country. I think the normal British person, common sense British person, can see that this experiment has nearly wrecked the country, our sense of ourselves, our ability to conduct a foreign policy. Could we do conscription to fight in a war? I would say we get involved in any war, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of people in our country who are positively on the other team. We've completely wrecked it. The economics hasn't been justified. That the alleged diversity is our strength can be seen to be a load of old rubbish. It's just the opposite. And Nigel Farage, love him or loathe him, for 25 years plus has been arguing, often very lonely, and there was maybe half a dozen of us in journalism backing him up, that mass immigration was irresponsible, not in the national interest, weakening our society. So whatever you think of him, you know that here's a guy who is prepared to say tough things on bringing immigration down and protecting our society. And the Tories have trashed their reputation in the most amazing way. And I don't think the new leadership gets that it's not a matter of just tweaking it and saying, oh, we may, the Priti Patel position, it's all fine. She's still Shadow Foreign Secretary. But the Kemi position is, oh, we made some mistakes. It was too high. It doesn't even get past first base of public opinion. So they need to be not only far more bold, but they've got all these, as you say, one nation, no nation wing, really, that obviously won't countenance radical retune policy. So for all these reasons, it's not a blip.
Well, let's come back to that in a second, because I do want to get a deeper take on your take on the Conservative Party and what you think they need to do. But let's just stick with reform for a second. You're clear it's not a blip. I think you're right. If we work on the basis there's going to be a general election in 2 or 3 years' time or 4 years' time, I mean, things move so fast, you never know. Between now and when that election is, do you think reform can maintain that poll lead? And the second question linked to that is what else do they need to do to kind of take it to the next level? Because at the moment, be devil's advocate, reform are very good at saying what's wrong, right? We can all say what's wrong. And they might have some solutions, but I don't think they've got a full suite of solutions at the moment. So does that bring us back to what we were talking about with Suzanne Evans and policy, that what they need to do in order to maintain that lead is to actually start showing a bit more leg, going, this is how we fix this is how we fix that, etc.?
Well, I think reform, in common with the other parties, you have to work on your weaknesses, right? Sometimes the wind's in your sail, and if you get blasé about that and think it's always going to be like this, then when it's not, you're in big trouble. Yeah. So, for instance, Donald Trump getting elected, the early weeks of that were magnificent for reform. Nigel had the in with Donald Trump doing stuff about illegal immigration or a different way of energy policy. All of this very appealing to centre-right voters in Britain. But now the last 2 weeks, you're seeing Donald Trump doing something on a really big issue, Ukraine and Putin, which is very unpopular with British public opinion, including centre-right British public opinion. And I know that the reform vote, if you look at the breakdown of polls, reform vote is less uncritically pro-Zelensky, but there's still a plurality. It still splits 60-40 for Ukraine rather than Putin. So this is suddenly a headwind for Nigel.
Is Putin Farage's weak spot?
I think that's the relationship with Trump. Can be a plus. But I'm just saying it's not a guaranteed plus. We're seeing that it could turn. If what happens to Zelensky in Ukraine turns out to be really brutal and a horrible, long-lasting thing, which then has other negative consequences, emboldening other tyrants across the world. Then, that's a millstone, particularly as Nigel, I think it was back in about 2015, was asked which politician do you admire? And he said, off the cuff, a bit of mischief making, he said Vladimir Putin. That is not helpful. So Keir Starmer yesterday in the Commons sort of had that in reserve when he apropos of almost nothing, accused Nigel of fawning over Putin, which he clearly wasn't, right? So reform needs to work on their weaknesses, their policy weaknesses, absolutely. I think that they're almost guaranteed to do well in Wales and Scotland. I think that's next year, which will be a big deal. I can't see where Labour's getting popularity back from, although I do think there's a jump to the cultural right thing going on with Starmer that Morgan McSweeney is behind, his number 10 guru, if you like. I'm not at all convinced by it. And the Tories, while they still have this huge phalanx of one nation, high status opinion people, I think...
I love the way... I'm sorry, I'm going to have to just interrupt for a second, because I love the way you say that. And it's not a criticism, a slight sneer in your voice. It's one nation. Because that's the subject of your recent Substack post, isn't it? And you give a brilliant list of examples, Exhibit 1 or Exhibit A, and
up to 7,
up to 7, of why the Tories still ran full of one nationers. And clearly you take the view, and I think you're right for what it's worth, that is their problem at the moment.
Well, I think in Tory terms, the so-called one nation wing has always viewed itself as being the sort of Brahmin statesman, high thinkers, centre ground, the ones who can get the votes, and the sort of, in the old days, the Bill Cashes and the Europhobes were the ones narrowing the party's appeal.
And they were sneered at a time. I remember very clearly people like Bill Cash, who I've interviewed over the years many times. You know, there were people in his own party who were literally, if he was on fire, they wouldn't put him out.
No. So the terms of trade have changed completely, right? And it's the One Nation wing which has become the voter repellent, but its chief personalities can't get their heads around that. That's not their own self-image. So if you look at the One Nation, the recent outburst criticising Starmer for cutting foreign aid was one that I very much...
Andrew Mitchell was particularly upset,
Andrew
wasn't he?
Mitchell, James Cleverly, Tobias Elwood from wherever he is these days, right? So it's not just an isolated thing.
I think that's where
that's where he'd like to be.
So now I would say anyone who's a zealot for net zero at breakneck speed, for not cutting foreign aid, a whole raft of other policies, on not making commitments on immigration, not leaving ECHR. All the people out in the country with these views detest the Conservative Party brand and will not vote for it. So One Nation so-called people are no votes politicians, and all they are doing is alienating the right-leaning cultural and social masses of this country, who now have another choice in reform, right? And if you ask yourself on a whole array of policy issues, do I know what reform stands for? You kind of instinctively do. You know, on immigration, whatever he's written down as policy, that Nigel and everyone in reform are going to be for cutting it massively. I haven't heard a single senior reform person come out and say we shouldn't leave the ECHR. You just know, right? So this party is united. On Law and Order too. They want to lock people up for longer who deserve to be in jail to protect the public. Half the Tory party is this sort of progressive, alternative.
Put them on a basket weaving course.
So you don't know what you're getting with the Conservatives, and yet Kemi, since she's become leader, has approvingly cited this phrase, a broad church.
Which you don't like.
No, I think it's electoral kryptonite, right? That's the problem. It's like an unlucky dip for the voters. Which faction is going to be predominant if I vote these people into Parliament? You don't know. And even going back to Brexit, every other party was united in its position. The Conservatives were split, and that led them, I would suggest, to mess up the aftermath and the negotiation of departure massively. So I think the Conservative Party is in massive trouble because of this idea that broad church is a good thing.
All right, we've only got a few minutes left, and there's a couple more things I want to cover very quickly, and I just want to stick with where the right, if you like, of the political spectrum in this country and the Conservative Party. So, and Will, I'll come to you in a second, but Patrick, given what you've just said, in order for the Conservatives to rise again, there's a phrase to use, is it as simple as booting out the One Nationers and becoming more like Reform? Or actually, are we starting to see the demise of the Tory party for good?
We might be. I mean, you would have thought that the 121 Conservatives who got elected in that disaster last year would be pretty confident individually of holding their own seats in, say, 3 or 4 years' time. They'd be going some to mess it up worse. Particularly against the Labour Party, which I suggest will have a lower vote share. So disappearing, maybe not, but a pathway to getting back to 300 plus MPs is difficult to see. I think, if you look at red wall seats, which gave the Tories a sort of qualified one-term go and have a go, and felt they got betrayed and let down, particularly on immigration. Reform is much, for instance, Hull East seat, I don't think the Tories have ever actually managed to win. In the last election, Reform, from a sort of 6-week standing start, came second there. Labour's vote share in that seat goes down every cycle, and it's one of the lowest turnout seats in the country. I'd be surprised if Reform didn't win that seat. The only impact of an active Tory campaign there would be to just save the Labour MP by the skin of the teeth. So there might be some organic understanding. I don't see a handshake, but an organic understanding among centre-right voters who by that stage will be completely fixated on getting Labour out to just vote for the party
tactically
in their seat without direction from on high that's got the best chance of getting Labour out, and maybe the Tories can prosper to a certain extent. But I would say they do need to sort this brand out and stand for more fundamental things.
Will, as a younger voter, and I'll ask you to be brief on this, so 30 seconds, in order for the Conservatives to perhaps rise again, what's the answer?
Stop the boats, build houses, crush crime. Simple.
Excellent.
That's pretty simple,
you should
really.
work in politics.
pretty simple.
Brilliant, and thank you for the brevity. And very quickly, I'm wary of this. This is a weekly podcast. We're recording this on a Tuesday afternoon. It gets released later this week. So the situation with Ukraine may well change in the next 48 hours. But I think what we can do is look back to last Friday and what we saw in the Oval Office. And I just really would welcome both of you, your takes on what we witnessed. Patrick?
Well, I think we witnessed Vance and Trump behaving very brutally, very badly.
Yeah.
Zelensky didn't play it particularly well. I was interested that the first social media posting Nigel put out about it was actually quite pro-Ukraine, and we all need to help them get the best deal at the end of that. I think since then he's been more critical personally of Zelensky for, quote, being rude to his mate.
Not wearing a suit.
Yeah, which I and also some reform people have gone along with this idea that Zelensky should be holding a general election in his war-torn country. So all that I think will be doing reform a bit of damage. And the best policy on Ukraine that reform can come up with is to talk about stopping the boats and Britain getting invaded by unvetted foreign males. Just don't talk about it. I think talk about that. That's the issue that is driving the reform vote share, not Ukraine.
I mean, obviously quite crazy. I'm not going to pretend I'm some sort of foreign policy affairs expert or international relations expert, but I did see one position come forward which I thought was interesting, which is basically this is all part of Trump's sort of 4D chess thing, right? He's playing off a bunch of people against each other and is actually saying things in order to get a desired result. So there's an element to which actually maybe Trump and Vance especially wanted to provoke Zelensky into doing something or saying something so that they could justify taking the arms and money away from him, so that it would force Zelensky to eventually come back to the table and then accept the minerals deal. So the argument usually from the perspective of those who are sort of more pro-Trump on this are saying that don't really listen to what he says, look at what he does, and also don't take what he says in the immediate moment to be what he actually thinks, because he is thinking a few steps ahead into what he can get out of this person or get out of a deal, because of course, he's known for loving a good deal. But again, we're going to have to see whether, Trump reneges on this and actually goes back to going, actually, Ukraine, you can have your funding back if you accept the mineral deal and sit at the table. We don't know, because ever since Trump's come into power, you can't predict what's going to happen the next day.
No. And the only thing we can be certain of in the world that we inhabit, in the world of politics, there's never a dull day when Donald's waking up in the White House. Listen, I'm going to wrap this up. Patrick, it's been brilliant. Thank you for coming in.
Great fun.
Can we tempt you back in the future?
Oh, definitely.
Marvellous. Excellent. Will, thank you as well. Will Yarwood from the TPA, Patrick O'Flynn, political commentator, on Substack, State O the Nation.
Yes.
Go and subscribe to it. There's a lot of great content on there. If you've liked what you've heard inside the last half an hour or so, you're going to love Patrick's Substack. So go and check it out. Any reaction to what we've been talking about, you are more than welcome to email. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Love getting your emails. You'll get mentioned on a future episode. And just a reminder, you find us on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. If you follow us on those particular platforms, that means you'll automatically get updated when there's a new episode. We're also on YouTube as well, so if you subscribe to us on YouTube, on the Taxpayers Alliance YouTube channel, you'll also get automatically updated. Thank you for listening.